Xyz summoning was added into the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG back in July of 2011. That means as of this month, Xyz summoning is 10 years old. We've had a decade with this mechanic. In today's video, I want to talk about the history of Xyz monsters, where they started and where they are right now, and also talk about the 3 biggest design philosophies that Xyz monsters have, in my opinion. So we have the first philosophy, which Konami has gone on record talking about in an old article. Xyz summoning is very generic. It's very easy to do. The second philosophy, in my opinion, is that Xyz monsters are temporary. The detaching mechanic is all about not having these effects be around for a long time, versus synchros and fusions, which can use their effects turn after turn after turn. And third, I think that Konami saw how temporary the Xyz monster effects were, and they decided to push these effects quite a bit as a result. If you guys enjoyed today's video, make sure to give it a like and also subscribe if you haven't already. Just in case you don't know how this mechanic works, the basic idea is that you overlay monsters that have the same level to summon an Xyz monster that has the same rank as those monsters' levels. This is obviously a pretty big departure from synchro summoning. You don't send like a tuner and one or more non-tuner monsters to the graveyard to summon this. You overlay monsters, and those actual physical cards are still going to be on the board, but those materials don't actually count as being on the field in terms of game mechanics, and also Xyz monsters don't have levels, they have ranks, so those two things were pretty confusing for a lot of players, and they caused a lot of ruling problems. I think people eventually got over it, and especially compared to pendulums and link monsters, these cards don't seem that confusing, but at first there definitely were a lot of questions. Anyway, without further ado, let's talk about the first design philosophy, and this is the one that Konami has gone on record talking about. They wrote an article about it a long time ago. They felt like synchro summoning, while cool, wasn't accessible to every type of deck, and that absolutely was true. While there were tons of great synchro summoning decks that topped tournaments and won tournaments, there were also a ton of decks that didn't play synchros at all. So I think that Konami saw that and they said, why aren't decks like Gladiator Beast playing synchro monsters? And the reason is that they couldn't really fit any tuners in their strategy. So Konami could have printed a new tuner monster for every single old deck, or they could make a more generic mechanic, and I think that's how they came to the conclusion of Xyz summoning. As Konami put it in one of those older articles, even if you only play like one level 4 monster, as long as you have 3 copies of that card in your deck, you might as well play a rank 4 in your extra deck just in case. Now obviously people nowadays don't really see it that way because extra deck space is pretty tight, but I think that was pretty true when Xyz summoning came out. And even nowadays, I think Konami sticks to this generic philosophy pretty well. While many archetypes have gotten their own dedicated Xyz monsters, Konami has released a ton of generic Xyz monsters that have been good throughout the years. The next design philosophy is all about Xyz monster effects being temporary, and this is a huge mechanic for Xyz monsters. This matters quite a bit. This is all about the overlay mechanic and how most Xyz monsters have to detach material to do some sort of effect. There are Xyz monster effects that don't require detaching material, but almost every single Xyz monster in the entire game at least has one ability that relates to its material. And this is very different compared to synchro monsters or fusion monsters, where once you get them on the board, you usually can use their effects over and over again. Think about Stardust Dragon, for example. If you summon that card turn 1, you might negate 1, 2, 5, 10 cards over the course of a duel. With Xyz monsters though, that wasn't really the case. Konami designed these cards to have effects that can only be used a handful of times, which was a pretty big departure from synchro summoning. The overlay mechanic in general was also very unique, and I know it turned a lot of people off from Xyz monsters initially, but looking back at it, I think it is a pretty cool idea. Overall, I feel like to this day, Konami mostly stands by this design philosophy when it comes to Xyz monsters. One mechanic that isn't really present all too often though, that was pretty popular way back when Xyz summoning was first released though, is that some of those early Xyz monsters had downsides when they didn't have any material. When you think back to Utopia or Leviathan Dragon, if they don't have material, they are a lot worse. And that idea is pretty interesting. It does add a new layer of risk versus reward with your card effects. Konami did this on other cards as well. For example, I think that Acid Golem of Destruction is a very interesting card that uses the detaching mechanic in a unique way and also has that downside when it doesn't have material. So I think that Konami was able to make some pretty cool cards using this risk versus reward mechanic, but I think early on Konami did realize that this wouldn't really be sustainable. Those Xyz monsters have aged very badly as we've gotten better and better Xyz monsters that don't have those downsides, so I think that's part of the reason that Konami stopped printing cards with that mechanic, for the most part at least. The third design philosophy, in my opinion, is that Konami looked at synchros and fusions compared to Xyz monsters, and they saw that Xyz monsters had more temporary abilities, so they decided to really push the power level of those effects. And I think that you can still see this to this day, because right now on the current ban list, there are more banned Xyz monsters than any other extra deck mechanic. Cards like Lavalval Chain and number 16 Shockmaster and Windup Carrier Zenmaity seem very ahead of their time. These look like modern cards, but they were released quite a while ago. While we've gotten plenty of broken synchro monsters throughout the years, I think that Konami was a little bit more willing to really increase the power level of Xyz monster effects because they couldn't be activated turn after turn after turn. The problem though is that as Yu-Gi-Oh! Became more of a first turn centric game, these cards not having long-term abilities stopped mattering as much. And I think a good place to look if you're trying to understand how good early Xyz monsters were would be to look back at the first 4 core sets and see how many of those Xyz monsters are still considered good by modern standards. Generation Force, the very first core set that had Xyz monsters, had LEVIATHAN the Sea Dragon, a card that is still used to this day. In Photon Shockwave, you had cards like the Evolzars, which are currently played in dinosaur decks 10 years later, and in Order of Chaos, you had 2 cards that are now banned, MX Saber Invoker and Windup Carrier Zenmaity. In Galactic Overlord had Gaia Dragon the Thunder Charger, Heretic Dragon King of Autumn, and number 11 Big Eye, all cards that are still occasionally played even in 2021. And of course, I'm only mentioning the cards that are still sometimes played nowadays. I'm not even covering all of the great meta-changing releases that were good back then. It's also been interesting to see how different ranks have been more popular throughout the years. Rank 3s were very popular when Xyz Summoning was first released, and then it was rank 4s, and then it was rank 7s. There's been all sorts of different formats where different ranks have been most popular, and I think that is pretty cool. Finally, I wanted to mention that I feel like Link monsters actually borrowed from Xyz monsters. I think Konami saw how well it went over with the community when they had these super generic Xyz monsters compared to the more specific synchro monsters, so they made an even more generic mechanic with Link summoning. It has been a crazy 10 years with Xyz summoning, and I think it does raise a bigger question: at what point do people start referring to Xyz summoning as an older mechanic? I've already seen this kind of happen with synchro summons. I know that there are a lot of die-hard old school fans that don't consider any extra deck mechanics to be old school, but I think a lot of older players actually do kind of consider synchros as older school at this point because they were released in some of the earlier years in Yu-Gi-Oh's history compared to a lot of the newer mechanics. I don't know, I'm sure to some people it seems impossible to call Xyz monsters old school cards, and to me it does feel pretty weird saying that. I don't think it would happen for quite a while, but depending on how long Yu-Gi-Oh is around for, we might someday look back at synchros and Xyz monsters as part of old school Yu-Gi-Oh. It just depends on how long the game lasts for, but I guess we'll get there when we get there. Anyway, I will see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.